Spring 1945. A displaced persons camp outside Mannheim, Germany. The wire fence hummed with silence. Beyond it, the world had ended. Also it seemed to the German women standing in clusters, their coats worn thin, their eyes tracking every movement. When the American jeep rolled to a stop, dust rising in soft clouds, they expected men, officers, orders. Instead, a woman stepped out. She wore olive drab trousers. Her hair was pinned back with casual efficiency. She carried a clipboard under one arm and walked with the kind of ease that didn't ask permission. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't hesitate at the gate. One of the German women, Ilse, pressed her fingers against the fence. She had been taught all her life what American women were: soft, frivolous, slaves to cosmetics and decadence. Weak. But the woman approaching the compound looked nothing like weakness. Ilse felt something crack inside her chest. Not hope, not quite. Something closer to confusion or fear. Because if everything she'd been told about American women was a lie, what else had been? For more than a decade, the Third Reich had constructed a carefully sculpted image of womanhood. It was taught in schoolrooms, broadcast over radio waves, woven into the fabric of parades and rallies and Sunday gatherings. The ideal German woman was modest, obedient, devoted. Her battlefield was the home. Her weapons were loyalty and childbirth. Her purpose was clear: to serve the folk, to raise sons for the fatherland, to embody purity in a world the Nazis claimed was rotting from within. The Bund Deutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls, indoctrinated millions. Young women learned to march in formation, to sing anthems of blood and soil, to see themselves as vessels of a racial destiny. They were told that their worth lay not in independence, but in sacrifice. That femininity was not strength, but surrender to a greater cause. Marriage and motherhood were elevated to the status of national duty. The Mutterkreuz, the Mother's Cross, was awarded like a military medal: bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, gold for 8 or more, and woven through all of it was a narrative about the enemy. American women, they were told, were corrupted, spoiled by capitalism and jazz music and Hollywood. They smoked in public. They painted their faces. They worked in factories not out of necessity, but out of some perverse rejection of natural order. They were loud, brash, unfeminine. They had abandoned their sacred roles, and in doing so, had weakened their nation. Germany, by contrast, understood the natural law. German women were disciplined, pure, strong in their submission. The propaganda was relentless. Posters depicted American women as shallow mannequins obsessed with material excess. Newsreels mocked their fashion, their freedoms, their audacity to speak as equals to men. The message was clear: American women were a cautionary tale, proof of what happened when a society abandoned traditional values. But while German women were being told stories, American women were living a different reality entirely. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the nation's industrial machine roared to life, and women answered the call. They flooded into factories, shipyards, and munitions plants. They became welders, riveters, engineers, and mechanics. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was 6 million women keeping the war effort alive. They built bombers and tanks. They tested aircraft. They worked 12-hour shifts, then went home to manage households alone, while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. And they didn't stop at the factory floor. Over 350,000 American women served in uniform. They joined the Women's Army Corps, the Navy Waves, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, the Coast Guard SPAs. They became nurses on the front lines, ambulance drivers in combat zones, pilots ferrying military aircraft across oceans. They decoded enemy transmissions. They operated switchboards under artillery fire. They earned rank. They gave orders. They buried their dead and kept moving forward. This was not the image the Reich had painted. By the time Allied forces began liberating Europe in 1944, American women were embedded in every layer of the occupation apparatus. They served as translators, administrators, intelligence officers, and camp supervisors. They processed refugees, managed supply chains, and interrogated prisoners. They wore uniforms with authority stitched into every seam. They carried themselves with a confidence born from propaganda, but from lived competence. When German women, prisoners of war, displaced persons, civilians fleeing the collapsing front, encountered these Americans for the first time, the collision was seismic. The women they met bore no resemblance to the caricatures they'd been fed. They were neither weak nor frivolous. They were organized, capable, and utterly self-possessed. They spoke directly. They made decisions without seeking male approval. They moved through the world as though they had every right to be there. For German women raised on a decade of indoctrination, the dissonance was almost unbearable. The foundation of their understanding about gender, about nation, about truth itself, began to crack. And in those cracks, something unexpected started to grow. The first meetings were small earthquakes of perception dotting camps across occupied Germany, in administrative offices and field hospitals. German women came face to face with their supposed inferiors and found themselves looking up. The American women didn't fit. They didn't match the templates burned into memory by years of state-sponsored messaging. There was no vapid giggling, no helpless dependence, no decorative emptiness. Instead, there was competence so casual it seemed almost careless. A German nurse, interned after the fall of Berlin, later recalled her first interaction with an American Red Cross worker. She had expected someone frivolous, perhaps kind in a pitying way. What she got was a woman who spoke 3 languages, who organized supply distribution with military precision, who didn't flinch when making hard decisions about limited resources. She didn't ask anyone's permission, the nurse wrote years later. She simply knew what needed doing, and did it. The cognitive dissonance was physical. Some women described it as nausea, others as a kind of vertigo. Everything they had been taught suddenly seemed like a stage set, and someone had just torn down the backdrop. If American women weren't weak, then what did that make German strength? If their independence wasn't decay, then what was submission? But nothing shattered the illusion quite like hierarchy. German women who had spent years bowing to male authority, fathers, husbands, party officials, now found themselves taking orders from women in uniform, female officers, female guards, female administrators who processed paperwork, assigned labor details, and made judgments about their fates. The Americans didn't apologize for their authority. They didn't soften it with deference or qualification. They simply exercised it. At Camp Calar in France, German women posed were supervised by WAC personnel. The American women carried themselves with an ease that bordered on incomprehensible. They issued commands in firm, clear voices. They didn't wait for men to validate their decisions. When disputes arose, they settled them. When discipline was required, they enforced it. And they did all of this while wearing trousers, while speaking freely, while moving through space as though it belonged to them. One German woman, Greta, watched an American lieutenant dress down a male soldier for improper conduct. The soldier accepted the reprimand without question. Greta felt something twist inside her. In her world, such a scene would have been unthinkable. Women didn't correct men in public. They didn't command respect through authority. They earned consideration through submission. But here was proof that another model existed, and it worked. Beyond authority, there was something even more unsettling, the sheer normalcy of American women's freedom. They smoked cigarettes in open air without shame. They laughed loudly. They wore lipstick not as an act of defiance, but as simple routine. They danced with soldiers at base socials, not as loose women, but as equals enjoying an evening. They spoke their minds in meetings, disagreed with male colleagues without consequence, and walked alone after dark without fear of scandal. 4 German women raised under the watchful eye of the Reichsfrauenfront. This casual autonomy was bewildering. Every action they had been taught signaled moral decay was here treated as mundane. An American typist could reject a date without explanation. A nurse could prioritize her career over marriage. A translator could travel between occupation zones unchaperoned. Her competence assumed rather than questioned. Marguerite, a former BDM leader imprisoned after the war, watched American women interact with male officers during camp inspections. They teased them, she later wrote, not flirtatiously, but the way brothers and sisters might. There was no distance, no performance of modesty. They were simply themselves. This ease of being, this unguarded existence, struck her as almost alien. She had spent her youth learning to measure every word, every gesture, every expression for proper feminine comportment. These women measured nothing. They simply lived. The internal rupture was profound. Some German women clung harder to what they'd been taught. They dismissed the Americans as exceptions, or explained them away as masculinized aberrations. They retreated into familiar certainties, insisting that true womanhood remained what the Reich had defined. To admit otherwise was to admit complicity in their own diminishment, but others couldn't unsee what they'd witnessed. Young women especially, those whose identities were less calcified, began to question if American women could be strong without cruelty, independent without chaos. Why had they been taught otherwise? What purpose had that teaching served? The questions spread like cracks through ice. Quiet conversations in barracks, shared glances across fence lines, whispered doubts that, once spoken, couldn't be unspoken. Anna, barely 20, wrote in a smuggled diary, "I thought we were protecting civilization, but what if we were just protecting men's convenience?" The words were careful, coded, afraid, but they existed, and they were not alone. The transformation wasn't universal. It wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. Once the curtain had been pulled back, once the propaganda had been confronted with living counter-evidence, something fundamental shifted. The certainty that had sustained them through war began to crumble, and in the rubble, difficult questions took root. The breaking point came not in grand declarations, but in accumulated moments too persistent to ignore. September 1945, Bad Kreuznach displaced persons camp. A group of German women, classified as civilian internees, were assembled for work detail assignments. The officer conducting the briefing was Captain Dorothy Miller, Women's Army Corps, 28 years old, from Ohio. She stood at the front of the room without notes, without hesitation, and laid out the day's tasks with clinical efficiency: laundry, kitchen duty, latrine maintenance, administrative filing. When she finished, one of the German women, Frau Weber, a former schoolteacher, raised her hand. "Shouldn't we wait for the male officer to approve these assignments?" Miller's expression didn't change. "I am the officer. These assignments are approved." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Frau Weber's face flushed. She had not meant to challenge authority. She had simply assumed that real authority, final authority, must come from a man. The realization that it didn't, that this woman's word was law, landed like a slap. Miller dismissed them. The women filed out, but something had shifted. Frau Weber told others what had happened. Some laughed nervously, others grew quiet. A few became angry, though they couldn't articulate at what. The anger wasn't really about Captain Miller. It was about the 12 years they'd spent being told that strength and submission were the same thing, that their worth was measured in how well they disappeared. October 1945, near Stuttgart, a German nurse named Hild was reassigned to work alongside American medical personnel at a field hospital. She had trained under the Nazi health system, where female nurses were expected to defer to doctors absolutely, where speaking up was insubordination, where intuition was irrelevant. On her third day, she watched an American nurse, Lieutenant Patricia Homan, challenge a doctor's diagnosis. The doctor had ordered morphine for a patient. Homan believed the symptoms indicated internal bleeding, not pain management. She said so, clearly, in front of others. Hild braced for the explosion, for the reprimand, for the humiliation that such insolence deserved. Instead, the doctor paused, reconsidered, ordered new tests. The nurse had been right. The patient's life was saved. Afterward, Hild approached Homan in the supply room. "Weren't you afraid?" she asked, of contradicting him. Homan looked genuinely confused. "Why would I be afraid? I'm a nurse. It's my job to notice things. If I see something wrong, I say something. That's how people stay alive. Hild had no response. In her world, silence was safety. Obedience was survival. But here was a woman for whom competence and voice were inseparable, who didn't see speaking up as rebellion, but as responsibility. That night, Hild lay awake in her bunk. She thought about every time she'd bitten her tongue, every intuition she'd suppressed, every moment she'd chosen compliance over clarity, and she wondered how many lives might have been different if she'd been taught to trust her own judgment. November 1945, Heidelberg occupation zone. The transformation wasn't happening in isolation. It was spreading, woman to woman, conversation to conversation, like a slow-burning fuse dot in a converted schoolhouse serving as temporary housing for displaced German civilians. A group of women gathered after curfew. They weren't supposed to congregate like this. Camp regulations discouraged unsupervised assemblies, but the guards, mostly American women themselves, often looked the other way. What had begun as practical discussions about rations and work assignments had evolved into something more dangerous, honest talk. Else, a widow whose husband had died at Stalingrad, spoke first. "My daughter is 7. When the war started, I taught her that women serve by staying small, by making room for men's ambitions. I told her that was strength." She paused, her voice dropping. "But I've been watching these American women. They don't make themselves small, and they're not weak. So what does that make everything I taught her? What does that make me?" Others nodded, murmured agreement. Someone mentioned the American mechanics they'd seen repairing trucks at the motor pool, their hands black with grease, their competence unquestionable. Another described a female intelligence officer who'd interviewed her, who'd spoken 4 languages and asked questions that revealed a mind sharp as any man she'd known. Then Gisela, a former BDM squad leader, spoke. Her voice carried the weight of someone confessing. "I enforced it, the rules, the expectations. I told girls they were serving the Reich by learning to be good wives. I believed it." She looked at her hands, callous now from camp labor. "But I think we were just being kept in place, not protected, controlled." The room went very quiet. This was the edge of heresy, not against the defeated Reich. That condemnation was now safe, even expected, but against the foundational story of their own lives. To admit they'd been controlled was to admit they'd been complicit in their own diminishment, that their sacrifices had been exploited, that their obedience had been weaponized. But once the admission was made, it couldn't be unmade. December 1945, a turning documented. American occupation authorities began conducting interviews with German civilians as part of denazification efforts. The transcripts, stored now in military archives, reveal the psychological fracture in real time. A 23-year-old woman from Munich, identified only as interviewee 247, told her questioner, "We were told American women had lost their femininity, that they were masculine and hard. But the women I've met here are not hard. They're just ... capable. They don't need permission to exist. I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know you could be a woman and also be ... whole." The interviewer noted that the subject became emotional during this statement, that she apologized repeatedly for crying, that she seemed unable to articulate exactly what she'd lost, only that she was grieving something ... by winter. The pattern was undeniable. German women weren't just processing military defeat, they were processing the collapse of a gendered ideology that had shaped their entire adult lives. The American women they encountered weren't villains or victims, they were simply free, and that freedom, a casual, unapologetic, functional, was more subversive than any political argument could have been. The old certainties were crumbling, and in their place, something terrifying and exhilarating was taking root, the possibility of reimagining what a woman could be. The war ended, but the reckoning had just begun. As displaced persons camps slowly emptied, and occupation zones transitioned toward reconstruction, German women carried their revelations home. They returned to cities of rubble, to a nation psychologically shattered, to households where men, those who survived, struggled with their own demons of defeat and complicity. The world they had known was gone, and the women who returned were not quite the same ones who had left. Some tried to forget, to bury what they'd seen and felt beneath the urgent work of survival. There were children to feed, homes to rebuild from bombed-out shells, a society to reconstruct from ash. In the immediate chaos of post-war Germany, existential questions about gender and freedom could feel like luxuries. Many women simply did what they'd always done, they endured, but others couldn't let it go. In the Western zones especially, occupied by American, British, and French forces, women began quietly testing boundaries. They took jobs that would have been unthinkable before the war, not just out of necessity, but out of possibility. They spoke more freely in public spaces. They questioned decisions made by husbands and fathers with less automatic deference. These weren't revolutions. They were small acts of recalibration, adjustments made by women who had seen a different way of being and couldn't completely unsee it. The statistics tell part of the story. By 1948, women comprised over 60% of the workforce in the Western zones. Many were war widows with no choice, yes, but surveys conducted by occupation authorities revealed something unexpected. A significant percentage expressed no desire to leave work even if financial circumstances improved. They cited independence, purpose, and, in carefully phrased language, a reluctance to return to complete domestic dependence. Historians would later document testimonies from this period. Women who spoke, decades afterward, about the American encounter as a pivot point, not a liberation. That word was too large, too clean. More like a crack in the wall, a glimpse through to a room they hadn't known existed. And once you'd seen that room, returning to the old one felt smaller than before. The cultural shift rippled outward in ways both subtle and profound. In 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany adopted its Basic Law, Article 3 declared men and women equal before the law. The provision was championed by 4 women delegates, including Elizabeth Selbert, who had to fight male colleagues every step of the way. Her arguments drew not just on principle, but on lived reality. German women had kept the nation functioning through apocalypse. They had cleared rubble with their bare hands, managed black markets, rebuilt infrastructure. They had proven capable of everything. The old justifications for legal subordination had been exposed as convenient fictions. The provision passed. On paper, at least, German women were equals. Implementation was slower, messier. Old attitudes didn't evaporate with new laws. Men who had returned from Soviet prisoner camps, who had lost the war and their sense of purpose, often clung harder to traditional gender hierarchies as one of the few sources of authority they had left. Tensions simmered in households across the country. Some women pushed, some retreated. Most negotiated an uneasy middle ground, but something fundamental had changed. In the collective consciousness, young women growing up in the 1950s and 60s, the daughters of those who had encountered American confidence firsthand, absorbed a different set of possibilities. They attended universities in increasing numbers. They pursued careers. They delayed marriage. They demanded contraception and divorce rights. When the German feminist movement exploded in the 1970s, it didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from seeds planted in displaced persons camps and occupation zones, where their mothers and grandmothers had first glimpsed what freedom looked like on a woman's face. American women, of course, had their own struggles. The post-war years pushed many back into domestic roles, and it would take another generation for them to reclaim the ground they gained during wartime. But for German women who had seen them at their peak, competent, authoritative, unapologetic, the image remained. A proof of concept, evidence that the propaganda had been wrong. By the 1960s, oral history projects began capturing these stories. Women spoke carefully, often reluctantly, about what it had meant to meet the enemy and find, instead, a mirror of what they might have been. The shame was still there, the grief for wasted years, but so was something harder to name. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. The acknowledgement that sometimes truth arrives not through argument, but through encounter, through seeing another human being live a life you were told was impossible. The encounter between German and American women during and after World War II became, in its quiet way, one of the unsung transformations of the post-war world, not the loudest legacy, not the most studied, but for the women who lived it. Undeniable. There is a particular cruelty in being taught that your cage is freedom. The German women who encountered American confidence in the aftermath of war were not liberated in a single moment. Liberation is rarely that clean. What they experienced was something more painful and more honest: disillusionment, the shattering of a story they had built their lives around, the recognition that their sacrifices had been real, but the ideals justifying them had been hollow. Propaganda works best when it tells you that your limitations are virtues, that your silence is strength, that your smallness serves something greater than yourself. It works until you meet someone who was never taught to be small and discover they are not monsters. They are not broken. They are simply free. The women on both sides of that encounter were products of their nations, their wars, their particular moments in history. But what passed between them transcended politics. It was the ancient, dangerous thing that happens when one human being sees another living proof that a different way is possible. History remembers the tanks and treaties, the generals and politicians, but in displaced persons' camps and occupation zones, in quiet conversations and unguarded moments, a different kind of reckoning took place. Woman to woman, worldview to worldview, and in that collision, the future cracked open, just enough for something new to grow. The women who lived it carried those cracks for the rest of their lives, some with regret, some with anger, some with a hard-won understanding that the truth, however painful, is always better than the lie, even when the truth arrives too late to give you back the years you lost believing it.